In the autumn of 2024, investigators in Cleveland, Ohio, faced a bizarre set of circumstances. A son and young father had been missing for over a week. The apartment where he was thought to be living was found cleared out. Both he and all of his belongings vanished, seemingly overnight. There were no cameras. In fact, there was no record of the man even living in the building. But what investigators did find were signs that something very sinister had happened inside that apartment. Apartment of a missing man, and finding almost nothing. No sofa, no television, no clothes hanging in a closet, no photographs, shoes, work equipment, or personal items suggesting that a young father had built any kind of life there. The rooms have been emptied so completely that it feels less like someone moved away and more like someone tried to erase him. But on the floor, investigators noticed something that cannot be packed into a box or carried out through the door. A dark stain, a trace of blood. And when testing later confirms whose blood it is, the disappearance of George Cox Jr. stops looking like a man who chose to leave. It begins looking like a crime scene that someone believed they had cleaned well enough. In the autumn of 2024, 32-year-old George Anthony Cox Jr. was living between Cleveland and the Detroit area while remaining connected to his family. Those who loved him called him June or Junebug. He was remembered as outgoing, unpredictable in the funniest way, and capable of turning an ordinary moment into a story people would repeat for years. He had attended Rhodes High School, completed training in information technology and customer service through Job Corps, and worked his way into a transportation supervisor role. Yet the most important title in his life was father. George had a daughter, Gianna, whom he described as the best part of himself. To the public, he would become a missing person poster. To his family, he was a son, a brother, a father, and the loud, magnetic presence suddenly missing from every room. George was last seen on October 18, 2024, near Bosworth and Peony Avenues on Cleveland's west side. His last known communication with relatives occurred around October 19th. Then the calls stopped. Messages went unanswered. Days passed without a believable explanation. For families of missing adults, the first days are brutal because many possibilities remain open. Hope survives by inventing ordinary explanations. But as one day became another, the silence around George grew heavier. He had a daughter. He had parents and siblings. He had people who expected to hear his voice. Vanishing without a word did not fit the man they knew. By November 8th, his family formally reported him missing. The Cleveland Division of Police Missing Persons Unit began trying to reconstruct his final movements. Investigators worked from the basic questions that begin almost every disappearance. Who saw him last? Where had he been staying? Who had spoken to him? What happened to his phone? What did the people closest to him know? Their attention eventually turned to the apartment George shared with his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Dy'mond Vaden, near Bosworth Road and Peony Avenue. A welfare check should have answered whether George was inside, injured, or simply refusing contact. Instead, officers encountered a scene that intensified the mystery. The apartment was vacant. There was little to no furniture. George was not there. Vaden had also moved away. It looked as though the life once contained inside the unit had been removed in a hurry. Then officers observed what appeared to be blood on the floor. Laboratory testing later confirmed that the blood belonged to George. The apartment was no longer merely the last place connected to a missing man. It was now a location where he had bled, after which the residence was emptied and the woman who shared it with him disappeared from the address. This was the moment the case changed. When an adult goes missing, investigators must initially consider that he may have left voluntarily. But a cleared apartment containing his blood points in another direction. If George had been hurt accidentally, why had no one called for medical help? If he had left by choice, why were his belongings gone and his blood left behind? If the apartment had been cleaned, what had the person cleaning it hoped officers would never find? The investigators did not yet have George's body. They did not have a public confession. They did not have a complete account of his final hours. What they had was an absence surrounded by evidence of violence. For George's family, the investigation entered the terrible space between hope and dread. A missing person appeal went public in November. Police described him as 5 feet 5 inches tall, around 160 pounds, with black hair and brown eyes. He had reportedly last been wearing a black and red jacket, black jeans, and Jordan shoes. His photograph circulated with requests for information, but weeks turned into months. Winter arrived, then winter passed. Every unknown caller could have been a detective with news. Every unanswered question became another private torment. George's father would later say he had begun to fear that his son might never be recovered. More than 100 miles from Cleveland, the Huron River moves through Erie County toward Lake Erie. In places, the river narrows into shallow, marshy water, bordered by reeds and low vegetation. On May 15, 2025, 2 people kayaking in the area noticed something that did not belong in the river. What they found was a human body, wrapped in a fitted bedsheet and bound with marine-style rope. The remains had been concealed long enough to become severely decomposed. Authorities responded, but identification would not be immediate. The river had finally returned a secret someone had tried to place beyond the reach of Cleveland detectives. Who was the man in the river? How had he died? Who had wrapped him? Who had tied the rope? And who had transported him from wherever the violence occurred to the water in Erie County? Investigators examined the remains and the materials surrounding them. The condition of the body made the work harder, but it did not make the truth unreachable. On July 2nd, authorities identified the deceased man as George Cox Jr. After more than 7 months of uncertainty, his family finally knew where he was. The answer ended the search, but opened a deeper grief. George had not walked away. He had been killed, concealed, transported, and left in the river. Identification connected 2 crime scenes separated by distance and time: the emptied Cleveland apartment where George's blood had been discovered, and the marshy river where his body had been recovered. Detectives now had the remains, the sheet, the rope, the biological evidence from the apartment, and months of phone data to examine. According to prosecutors, the fitted sheet around George matched sheets found in the apartment he had shared with Vaden. George's blood was also discovered on clothing recovered from Vaden's residence. DNA evidence and phone records further linked her to the crime. What may have looked like an erased scene was beginning to reconstruct itself, one trace at a time. The evidence showed investigators that clearing a room is not the same as clearing history. Furniture can be removed, a lease can end, a phone can be replaced, clothing can be moved to a different home, but blood can remain in seams and fibers. Matching household items can connect a body to a room. Cell phones create timelines through calls, messages, searches, and location information. A person may remove the obvious objects from a crime scene, yet overlook the invisible record created by modern life. In George's case, the empty apartment had looked blank. The science behind it was not blank at all. On July 21, 2025, Cleveland police arrested Dy'mond Vaden at a new residence she shared with Emmanuel McQueen Jr. A firearm was recovered during the arrest, and both occupants were legally prohibited from possessing one. 4 days later, a Cuyahoga County grand jury indicted Vaden on 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, tampering with evidence, gross abuse of a corpse, and having a weapon while under disability. McQueen was separately indicted on a weapons charge. For George's family, the arrest did not undo the months of searching or restore the funeral they should have been able to hold, but it marked the first public step toward accountability. The most disturbing details emerged later in court. Vaden ultimately admitted that on October 18, 2024, she stabbed George in the abdomen during a violent confrontation. George did not die instantly. He remained alive while losing blood. At that point, there was still a choice. Call 911. Apply pressure to the wound. Get help from a neighbor. Drive him toward a hospital. do anything that placed his survival above fear of arrest or exposure. But no emergency call came. Instead, Vaden used Google to search a chilling question about the chances of surviving after being stabbed multiple times in the abdomen. That search is one of the darkest elements in the case, because it captures a decision being made in real time. It suggests that the person beside George understood he might still be alive and wanted to know whether he would survive. The internet was used not to locate the nearest emergency room or learn how to stop bleeding, but to calculate the likelihood of death. Vaden later told the court that events had happened quickly and claimed efforts were made to save him. Yet she also admitted that she did not call the police. George bled to death inside the apartment while the window for intervention closed. After George died, the choices became even more deliberate. Vaden admitted that she contacted friends for help disposing of his body. His remains were wrapped in a sheet, secured with rope, transported away from Cleveland, and placed in the Huron River. The apartment was emptied. George's belongings vanished. Vaden moved to another residence. To anyone looking from the outside, it could appear that George and everything associated with him had simply disappeared. But his family did not accept the silence, and detectives did not accept the apartment at face value. For 7 months, the people who loved George lived without the most basic truth. They could not stand beside his body. They could not arrange a proper burial. They could not say goodbye with certainty. By the time he was recovered, decomposition was so advanced that his family chose cremation. At sentencing, George Cox Jr. described the pain of seeing what had been done to his son. The horror was not limited to the killing itself. It included the concealment, the waiting, the missing person posters, the unanswered calls, and the knowledge that while the family searched, someone already knew exactly where George had been taken. Investigators also examined Vaden's conduct after the killing. Prosecutors highlighted a message she sent to her new boyfriend on the same day George's body was found. The text read, "You gonna be missing next." Vaden later said the message had been misunderstood and was intended as concern because the man had not been answering her. Prosecutors argued that the timing and wording showed something much darker. The message arrived on the very day the river exposed George's remains, while Vaden knew what the word missing had meant for George and his family. At her March 2026 sentencing, Cleveland homicide detective Kevin Callahan took the unusual step of addressing the judge. After 3 decades in law enforcement, he said this was the first case that compelled him to speak at sentencing. He warned the court not to be misled by Vaden's calm presentation, calling her highly manipulative and describing a profound absence of remorse. His point was not that evil always announces itself through rage or chaos. Sometimes it appears polite, sometimes it speaks carefully, sometimes it presents an explanation for every disturbing fact, and hopes each explanation will be considered alone rather than as part of a pattern. Vaden had originally faced murder charges, but the case ended through a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, felonious assault, and offenses involving George's body. Judge Richard Bell sentenced her to an indefinite prison term with a minimum of approximately 19 years and 8 months and a maximum of about 25 years and 2 months. The sentence recognized the killing and the treatment of George's remains, but no number could return the months stolen from his family or the years stolen from his daughter. True crime stories are often built around the offender because the offender creates the mystery. But the center of this case is not the empty apartment, the Google search, the rope, or the woman who was sentenced. The center is George. He was born in Cleveland on October 6, 1992. His family remembered his jokes, his pranks, his spontaneity, and the way he could fill a room. He pursued job training, worked, supervised transportation, and remained connected to relatives in Cleveland and Detroit. Above everything else, he loved his daughter. When the case is reduced to evidence, labels, and charges, it is easy to forget that a child lost her father and parents lost their son. The case also demonstrates why missing person investigations matter even when the missing person is an adult, and even when the early evidence is incomplete. George's disappearance did not begin with a body or a witness describing the killing. It began with silence. A family said the silence was wrong. Officers checked an apartment. A stain was tested.